The election results that no one saw coming. This is the IssuesWatch podcast. Hi, I'm Jeff Kazerman, Vice President of Government Relations at the New Jersey Society of CPAs, and welcome to the IssuesWatch podcast. Last week, when I was drafting up some questions for this podcast, I assumed, like everyone else, that the November 2nd election was going to be another dull event with the Democrats comfortably winning the governor's race and maintaining or increasing their majorities in the legislature. Well, needless to say, things didn't quite turn out that way. As far as the political class in New Jersey is concerned, we had an earthquake. Here to help us review and analyze the election results is Professor Ben Dworkin, Director of the Rowan University Institute for Public Policy and Citizenship. Ben and I go way back to when, believe it or not, this is long ago, we were both young and good looking. At least I like to think I was. Those were the good old days. So anyway, welcome, Ben. So good to have you back.
Well, at least one of us remains good looking, Jeff.
Well, you always were a little bit younger than me, I think. Before we move into the how and why of these surprising election results, can you give us a brief overview of the results? And since there seemed to be a similar dynamic at play in Virginia, the only other place with statewide elections, could you also give us a rundown on the results there?
So here in New Jersey, the incumbent Phil Murphy, running for a second term as governor, won. It was closer than most people think. It was not razor thin as we originally sensed on election night, but most of the polls heading into the election had him at least 5 or 6 points ahead of his challenger, Republican Jack Ciattarelli. And I think right now, with almost all the votes counted, it looks like he'll win by 1.5 points as opposed to 5 points. In Virginia, they have a one-term limit for governors, and so nobody ever runs for re-election. Terry McAuliffe, who had been governor, had been away for 4 years, was now running again as the Democrat to be governor again, and he ran against a guy named Youngkin, a businessman who provided a very affable, engaging personality that somewhat embraced Donald Trump, but not quite too much to scare away the core vote of suburban voters in Northern Virginia and the Washington, D.C. suburbs. And Youngkin won. So the Republicans picked up a governor's seat, and they maintained a governor's seat here in New Jersey.
And also, as far as the legislative races were concerned, since all seats were up this year, the Republicans, you correct me if I'm wrong, they're still a minority, but they picked up a few seats in competitive districts, some of them which were unexpected. Is that right?
Yes. So here in New Jersey, the Republicans have at least 6 seats that they gained in the state assembly, and it could go up to 8. But again, literally as we are talking, Jeff, the new results are coming in. So we're figuring that out right now. But at least there's a pickup of 6, which will still keep the Republicans in the minority. Right. Democrats will retain control in the state assembly. In the state Senate, Democrats flipped a Republican seat in the center part of the state, in the 16th legislative district, which is, South Brunswick and Princeton and Somerville, that sort of neck of the woods. So they flipped a Republican seat, turned it blue, but Republicans flipped 2 seats that were Democratic, and now we're going to be represented by Republicans in the 8th district, a very competitive district, several $1 million spent on that race, but the Republican, Gene Stanfield, emerged victorious. And in the shocker of the political season, and as political for the decade, as far as we are here, in District 3, State Senate President Steve Sweeney was defeated by a practically unknown Republican, and who spent, as far as we can tell, according to his last financial filing, less than $200
Yeah,
to win
that's
the seat.
amazing.
So it is, if nothing else, because Steve Sweeney has been such an influential and central force within the New Jersey political ecosystem, his loss really upends everything.
Yeah, it's and it was so sudden and out of the blue. I don't think there was anybody who saw this one on the radar. So let's dig deeper into the dynamics that brought about these very surprising results. Do you think there were any big public policy issues at play, like COVID or property taxes, anything in particular that had an impact?
Well, yes. I mean, look, I think one of the things that a lot of political observers have been trying to figure out is, where did we go wrong? What did we not understand? And I think there are two key factors that were underappreciated as we headed into Election Day. We saw them, we just didn't recognize how significant they might be in this election. And the first one were the headwinds that were going to be faced by the Democrats, and Phil Murphy in particular. When I say the headwind, they're running into, there was just a stronger wind, and it comes in two parts. The first is political, and the other one is societal. The political headwind was really the Democratic dysfunction in Washington, D.C. It just depressed Democratic voter enthusiasm and probably had an impact on Democratic voter turnout. If you're a proud Democrat or want to be a proud Democrat, there hasn't been a lot to be proud of, just because the party in Washington, which is very visible and on the news all the time, seems to be squabbling amongst themselves and can't agree to get anything done.
Right.
This has been so it's a difficult time. And so you're not feeling good about being a Democrat. And I think that had an impact and a drag on Democratic voter performance here. The second headwind was more societal. And I think we didn't really appreciate how angry, frustrated, and bitter the electorate is right now. If you're the person who's now forced to pay $3.45 a gallon for gas, you can't even afford to buy a new car that might be more fuel efficient because you can't buy new cars these days. Your child may well be suffering from additional anxiety after a year of home learning, pandemic learning, where there may well be significant learning loss. So you're concerned about that. Your job might be perhaps a little bit skittish. You're not sure if you're going to be able to keep it. You're not sure you necessarily want to do it. You've got customers yelling at you because of requirements that you're supposed to enforce. If you own a business, you're suffering in any number of different ways, even as the government tries to help with additional funding here and there. So all of these things built up. And I think most political observers understood they existed. We know what gas was. We just didn't know how angry the electorate would be when they walked to cast their ballots because of it. So those are the two headwinds I think we were underappreciated as we headed in. The second factor I think that was underappreciated heading into the election was really what I would call COVID credit versus COVID blame. We saw these polls, and a clear majority of New Jerseyans said, we give credit, we give good points. A majority of us think that Phil Murphy did a solid job in managing the pandemic. New Jersey was a state where we were ready to put up with inconvenience for the sake of public health. Now, not every state can say that, but we certainly could say it here. And Phil Murphy had been in line with that. And a lot of us thought, hey, that's going to lead him to a victory here, because he didn't fudge the numbers like Cuomo did in New Jersey. He didn't, engage in overt hypocrisy about mask wearing by going and hang out with lobbyists without masks, like they had in California, which ended up forcing a recall of their governor.
Wow.
No, instead he did a solid job, and every poll said that. Not everybody liked it. but a clear majority. And a lot of us assumed that that meant they would vote for him. And I think what we underappreciated was the passion with which the people who disagreed with Phil Murphy, the people who were ready to blame him for the way things were going, they were ready to come out and vote because of it. And those who gave him credit were not necessarily inspired to to go out and say, yes, he deserves re-election because he got us through. He got us through, but it wasn't an inspiring, what are you going to do for me in the next 4 years kind of message. Right. It was, thanks for helping me get through this storm, which is still here. So I think we sort of misplayed and perhaps underappreciated how much the COVID blame was going to, even though it was a minority of New Jerseyans, was going to really motivate a sizable chunk of voters. So those two things, the headwinds and COVID, credit or blame, those were the things, the factors that I think were really, we knew they were out there. We just didn't necessarily fully appreciate the effect they would have on the election.
It's interesting. I did not pick up on that anger at all either. I thought that was pretty much a thing of the past, going back to the Trump and Biden election, and that was pretty much, over with now. Now, I read somewhere that, I'm sure you've heard this, that the Democratic turnout was lower than expected and the Republican turnout was stronger than expected. But then somebody, and maybe I misinterpreted this, but I thought somebody said, well, actually, the Democratic turnout was a little bit better than 4 years ago, but the Republican turnout was so phenomenal that it blew away the Democrats. So I have that right, or was there just a depressed turnout amongst Democrats all around?
Well, look, let's first, overall, I think what we're going to end up right about where we expected turnout to be, which in the past few gubernatorial elections has been about 39% of registered voters. And that meant we're going to have 2.4, 2.5 million people vote. And that's where, once every vote is counted, that's where we'll be, right around there. So overall, the turnout was not significant. Now, the question is, who are these people voting for? To win a statewide election in New Jersey, the key, a fundamental strategy for both sides is to run up the margins, run up the numbers that you generate out of your base counties, your hardcore Democratic or Republican counties. And both parties did that. So on the Republican side, Ocean County, Monmouth County, Ocean County gave Jack Ciattarelli a margin of 76,000 votes. That's bigger than what Chris Christie used to get, and he had set the record, more than anybody else had done out of that county. Monmouth County, 45,000, 46,000 vote plurality for Jack Ciattarelli. So on the top counties, it made a real difference. In the Democratic side, Essex County, 72,000 votes were as a plurality. In Hudson County, about a 55, 56,000 vote plurality. These were big numbers. It's what they needed to be competitive. Where we saw the fall off was in the second tier Democratic counties. And then we saw big Republican numbers in some of the other areas as well, in second tier, meaning not your top priority counties. So in Bergen County, Democrats won the county by about 13,000 votes. 4 years ago, they won it closer to 30,000 votes. Wow. Passaic County, this was considered to be a major Democratic target. Passaic County 4 years ago gave Bill Murphy over Kim Guadagno 21,000 vote plurality. This year, it gave him less than 2,000 vote plurality.
Wow.
So
big difference.
That kind of fall off, that was there. If you look at the top 13 counties by population, and you compare Democratic performance in this election to last year, to a presidential election, people are always going to fall off, right? I mean, there's always going to be less turnout when it's not a presidential year. Presidential year gets lots of people to be there, but it could be 5 to 10%. And what we saw here is that Democratic performance underperformed what it did in 2020 by 8 to 18%. It was significant there. And so we just saw more Democrats, again, I think headwinds, both the political and societal, that were facing Democratic performance this year. So overall, turnout was the same than we've had in years. But every election has its own dynamics, its own candidates, its own motivating issues, and Republicans outperformed certainly what the polls were telling us, and Democrats performed well in their top targets, but did not perform as well as they wanted to in their second-tier targets.
Let's go back to Senate President Steve Sweeney again, who you discussed earlier. What in the world happened in that race? Now, he easily withstood a $5 million campaign, both for advertising and then on the ground grassroots work. $5 million campaign by the powerful teachers union. He easily withstood that in the last election. This time he gets beat by somebody who nobody's ever heard of, a complete political novice who spent less than $200. So what's going on here? And did any of this have to do with maybe South Jersey voter animus against the so-called George Norcross South Jersey Democratic machine? What was going on here?
Okay, first of all, just the legislative race where the NJEA, the New Jersey Education Association, was not his last election, but it was a couple elections ago, and it was exceeded 5 million several fold. I mean, there were altogether $20+ million spent on that one race. So it was even bigger than what you described. And he still won that by 10 points. He won his last election where it was not significantly challenged by 10 points. There was no reason to expect anything different to happen this year. Everyone was caught by surprise here. As far as we can tell, and it's still early, but as far as we can tell, it had nothing to do with any kind of animus towards the political organization that South Jersey Democrats have embraced at all. I don't even think people were voting for, the candidate didn't offer himself. I don't even think they were voting against Steve Sweeney per se. What we're looking at is an electorate that was just upset and they just voted for somebody different. It wasn't even that they had a problem with Steve Sweeney. They were just upset with how things were going. They were upset with Trenton. And, that's a bad place. If you're an incumbent, it's a bad dynamic to have to face. And Steve Sweeney got caught in a district that has grown more conservative on him, even for a pretty moderate Democrat that he is. It was a tough and, in the end, insurmountable situation. But we have to think of it like a tsunami, just a wave that came out of nowhere. Right,
which is kind of how I've been thinking about this whole thing. It's funny, everybody on the inside the Beltway, so to speak, was very calm and sheepish about this whole election, kind of drowsy, yet apparently nobody knew it, but the electorate was pretty fired up. So let's look at, something you've been hearing about, I've been hearing about, I'm sure everybody has for a long time, this supposedly insurmountable edge that the Democrats have built in New Jersey by bringing in 1 million new registered Democrats over the past decades, which gives them, I believe, a 2 million to 1 million advantage in registered voters over the Republicans. So what's going on? Are these newly registered Democrats, are they really the kind of voters who only vote in presidential elections?
So no, there's a lot here. First of all, let's understand how quickly this has happened. 15 years ago, 15 years ago, registered Democrats outnumbered registered Republicans by about 270,000. Today, as you pointed out, it's over 1 million. And so what happened over that period of time? Two things: Chris Christie and Donald Trump. They motivated a number of people. If you were registering, a lot of people registered as Democrats. And it actually started, let me amend what I just said. It really started with the primary battle in 2008 between Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama. That motivated, it was the year, 2007 is the breaking point. 2007, we had very stable kind of registration numbers for a decade. And then it popped. Then suddenly you had this flood, hundreds of thousands of new registered Democrats started, and it's grown. From that primary, it's grown because of, there's nothing more unifying than a common enemy. And so all the Democratic factions were clearly aligned, in opposition to Chris Christie, in opposition at a certain point in the latter half of his term, of his second term, and then certainly from the beginning against Donald Trump. And that has helped propel them to this kind of margin. What is important to recognize is that it's not insurmountable, as Jack Ciattarelli showed us, because it's a margin on paper. It doesn't mean anything if they don't all show up. The reason this 1 million registration advantage is so significant is because we live in an increasingly hyper-partisan political atmosphere. And so it matters even more now whether you have a D or an R next to your name, especially in federal elections. And so I think that's where this advantage really continues to come into play. But in the right circumstances, as Jack Ciattarelli showed us, unless these people show up to vote, it's not going to matter.
Right. So do you think national politics impacted the elections, or do you think it was more, all about state and local issues?
I think we were largely in this 2021 election focused on the state. Focused on what people were dealing with, bread and butter issues. How am I going to afford this? Do I have a job? We talk about just the implications of COVID continuing. Unvaccinated children are back in school, which is great. So parents can now go back to work. But then your 7 or 8 year old gets a sniffle, gets a headache, and that's a COVID symptom. So now the kid has to come home and you have to get them a PCR test, which takes 2 to 3 days to turn around, which means the parent, at least one of them, has to stay home with the child. So the boss is frustrated, the manager is frustrated, the parent is frustrated, the kid is frustrated, everybody's unhappy in this kind of a situation, and it becomes very difficult to kind of get some routine. There have been articles, and I've seen people like, no, we're all getting used to living with it. No, not. I wouldn't argue that. I think New Jersey kind of showed like we're not particularly getting used to this, and it's it's having ripple effects in our political system. So was this about national issues? Look, certainly Biden's falling approval rating, the Democratic performance in Washington was a drag, but that's not why people voted. It was a weight around the ankles of the Democratic populace here in New Jersey. They weren't as enthused as maybe if things were going well for them in DC. But this really wasn't about national issues. It wasn't about a war. It was about how we're dealing with stuff in New Jersey. And that's one of the reasons why it was so close.
Do you think this was the results were a referendum on Murphy's left of center or progressive agenda? And will it, if you think it did, will it have an impact on his next 4 years? Policy wise, do you think we'll see no more tax hikes maybe, or maybe no more?
Yeah, no, look, there were certainly folks who voted for Phil Murphy who were motivated by the kinds of things he did. They wanted to see a higher minimum wage. They wanted to see millionaires have a higher tax rate bracket. They wanted to have more affordable college education. They wanted Planned Parenthood to be funded and reproductive rights to be protected. They wanted the state to be involved in anti-climate change efforts. All these things were proved very popular individually, and I'm sure there are some segment of the population who voted specifically because of those issues. But moving forward, we're unclear as to what a second term is going to be. the biggest promise that Phil Murphy has made for his second term, aside from a sort of more of the same kind of sort of vagueness, is that there will be no new taxes. He's made that pledge very carefully. So we'll have to see whether he can pull it off. It'll be interesting to watch, but okay. I think
Yeah.
the business community obviously wants stability. And if we're looking at the second term, I don't know how many new ideas we're going to come up with.
Right.
They need to find funding, a reliable source of funding for New Jersey Transit. I mean, there are some investments that need to be made, but generally they want to manage things and keep it going. And since they're not raising any new taxes, there's going to be no new burst of funding to fund some giant new initiative.
Right. Was he, by the way, I don't recall, was he specific in that no new taxes pledge? Was that like no new taxes for the next 4 years or?
Yes. Yeah. No. In the
Oh,
debate,
really? Okay.
he said it, and he said it in a previous event, and then said it in the debate. So
Wow.
yes.
Okay. So, what impact, if any, do you think the New Jersey and Virginia results will have on the national political scene? I know, newspapers all over the country are writing about what happened here in New Jersey and in Virginia. Is this going to weaken the hand of, for example, the pretty powerful Democratic Progressive Caucus in Congress? Will it strengthen their opponents, the centrist Democrats? Is this going to affect the whole infrastructure battle over, that versus the social welfare spending? So are we going to see this have an impact on Washington?
Okay, there's a lot there. Let me try. Let me try and break that down a little bit. There are some national implications for this, but first of all, we should remember, and this is just a function of the 24/7 news society we live in. News people have to fill the air, and these were the only two elections. You got to talk about it somehow.
Right.
And saying that was New Jersey has nothing to do with the rest of us is boring. And so someone's got to come up with something, even if it's not necessarily true or an exaggerated version of what might happen. Let me offer a couple ideas. First of all, I think it's a wake-up call to Democrats, which is a cliche phrase, but let's talk about what it means. Again, any politician running for office, or certainly an incumbent, needs to appreciate how frustrated, angry, and bitter the electorate is. It's as if no one's had a good night's sleep in 6 months. They all woke up and were told to vote before they had their coffee. This was just grumpy. And that's a dangerous place to be if you're in charge here. So Democrats are in charge in Washington. So I think that's a real challenge to them. They've got to speak to the voters and their concerns, as opposed to the agenda items that they want to check off because it's part of some wish list. So Are the moderates going to be strengthened? You asked about the progressives. I don't. Everyone's going to interpret it the way they're going to do. If they're smart, I think they will take this and say, we can't afford these dynamics to continue if we're going to have a shot in 22, if we're going to have a shot in 24. And so if the Democratic Party can figure out a way to move forward and speak to real voter concerns about how they put food on the table and how they maintain a coherent American way of life, that's going to be, that should be their focus there. So that's part of it, a little bit of a wake-up call. I think political polling took a hit. That's part of the national polling, part of the national conversation. Do we trust polls? And let me say this, just as as an academic, there are other ways of measuring public opinion besides polling. Polling is the easy way because it gives you a number and makes it a horse race. This is up, this is down. Here's where it was before, here's where it is now. Snapshot, we now know and we can talk about it. But it clearly doesn't get enough of the feeling behind the answers. And for that, you need something called a focus group, which lots of people in marketing do.
Yep.
But I think we have to find a way for public interest focus groups that will share and help reveal some of the things that I think polling has been missing, simply because we have it in the conversation. A third national implication for this is certainly Republican enthusiasm. They won in Virginia. They almost won in blue New Jersey. This is great for them. So it means that the Republican candidates who run in the next year, the next 2 years, are going to be top tier, very talented politicians. There's a certain politics of ambition dynamic that goes on. If you think it's going to be a good year for your party, you run. And so the talented people who can raise money, who have a gift of being able to talk to people and are sort of just talented politicians, not everybody is, they're the ones who throw their hat into the ring when they think it's going to be a good year. And when they think it's going to be a bad year, they stay home. And they're like, this is not my time. So I think Republicans are going to be enthused, and they're going to have a lot of very talented Republicans running. And because Democrats will be less enthused, the most talented Democrats, incumbents, might retire, as we've seen, and the most ambitious and talented Democratic candidates who might be ready to come up and run for Congress are like, yeah, I'm not going to do it in a midterm of Joe Biden's first term. The national implication of New Jersey's election is that it affects Trump. Donald Trump, I think, is clearly running in 2024. He wants the Republican Party to be his party. We've seen that. It's been very overt. And those who don't, the never Trumpers were looking for an opportunity to say, we can move beyond this guy. We can get beyond, you don't need Donald Trump to win. For all these politicians, their first priority is to win. And there are folks out there who say, well, that's, it. Chuck Grassley, the US Senator from Iowa, came out and he made the joke that, hey, I was born at night, but I wasn't born last night. So let me tell you what I know. When 91% of Republicans in Iowa support Donald Trump, I support Donald Trump. You can't get a more clear example of a guy who might have had a different opinion had it not been for 91% of his public wants it. That's what Donald Trump has been trying to cultivate and build. And what we saw happen in New Jersey, I think, gives some strength to those who would say, that's not the direction you have to go. You can win, come close, practically win for a Republican in New Jersey against a Democrat without having Donald Trump come in, do a rally, do an endorsement. So those are four national implications for these races.
Right. So do you think there's a possibility that Chitterelli will demand a recount? And if he does, I don't think there's no indication to me that we would find out anything different after a recount, but do you think he'll do it? And do you think it could be successful?
I'm not sure he's going to do it. I know there's talk, and I think there'll be political pressure. The Republican Party after 2020 has been cultivated and sort of steeped in this notion of there's fraud. Now, it doesn't appear to be any fraud in New Jersey. 2.5 million people cast ballots. I'm not saying there aren't glitches. There are. But is it enough to make a difference? Well, let's demand a recount if we're talking about a couple thousand votes. But the margin throughout today has gone from 20,000, and now it was close to 45,000 vote margin. And we should remember we've had close elections, but this is not even close. This is getting to a point and a half, almost 2 points election. So in 1993, Christy Whitman beats Jim Florio. She beats him by about 25,000 votes, 1% difference between the two. 4 years later, Christy Whitman beats Jim McGreevey in 1997, about 24,000 vote difference. Frustrating for Democrats for certain, a 1%, but there was no recount.
Right,
If it's
right,
2,400 votes, it's one thing. It's 24,000 votes, it's another. Now we're talking about 40,000 vote difference. I'm not sure that a recount is in order. But again, the dynamics, I recognize that there'll be folks who are going to be calling for that, demanding
right.
that, because that seems to be where we go. And we'll have to see whether the Cettarelli campaign and the candidate and his very capable staff decides this is worth it. We think something will be changed. But right now, I think the number has gotten big enough that they probably won't call for a recount.
Right. Yeah, no, that makes sense. Another sort of inside the baseball question. Have the Democrats decided at all, or do you think there's any indication of who they're going to settle on to be the Senate president in 2022?
I think that has been happening since Tuesday night. There are numbers of conversations that you and I don't get to be on, Jeff, but that's, it is, we should understand the significance of Steve Sweeney. And let me just take a moment to talk about that. He has served longer as Senate president than any other Senate president in history, 12 years. And he was set to serve another 2 in this term. He has the epitome of a very pragmatic politician, which got him in trouble sometimes because of his pragmatism and people who were frustrated with that. An advocate for people with special needs, an advocate for South Jersey, an advocate for health and pension benefits reform. So a number of things, really nothing has gone through in the state and legislatively without his approval over the last 12 years. Now, the way Democratic politics works, since the Democrats are in charge of both houses of the legislature, there's a very delicate balance of power that exists between North Jersey and South Jersey. And South Jersey was represented by Sweeney. He, in effect, was the king of the Senate. And now that the king is gone, it's a little bit of a Game of Thrones situation. And lots of people are trying to say, hey, I deserve to be on that. But you have all the different fiefdoms. Again, there was that balance of power that had been figured out and the deals have been cut. So now that you take somebody out of it, someone of the stature of Steve Sweeney, we have to see how it'll all play out. There are a number of the members of the Democratic caucus who are trying to position themselves. And it really, again, you're going to have 24 Democrats in the state Senate. So you need 13 of them to make sure that you become Senate president. We'll have to see. Literally, a deal might be cut by the time we're done with this broadcast. It's all happening right now.
Okay, so then this is something they're going to have to move on soon, right? I mean,
well, no one waits for the actual vote. These are things that you move on very quickly,
right?
Because if you don't, then someone else is cutting a deal behind your back.
Right. Okay, so I have one last question, Ben.
Sure.
How is it that the polls and the political class, meaning, political junkies, people who work in the, campaigns, lobbying, etc., how come nobody, including me, for example, as well as everybody and anybody I know, how come nobody anticipated any of this, of what happened? Why did we all miss it?
Well, again, I was one of those people who kept saying, look, here are all the reasons why Murphy should win. He's got a very popular progressive agenda. All these things that he can say he actually done, he can run on his record and he can say, I did these things. And they all polled north of 55, 60% approval. He had detente within the Democratic Party, which can often, be shooting at each other as much as Republicans. So, but everybody understood that we're all on the ballot together. This mattered. Okay. And then he had more money than Jack Shirley, which is New Jersey is a very expensive state to advertise in because you have to advertise on New York network TV and Philadelphia network TV. These are the first and fourth most expensive media markets in the country. He had the 1 million registered voter advantage that we talked about. So for all of these, and he was given high marks for handling COVID. So all of these things drove us to say, yeah, this, Phil Murphy should win this thing. And we were confirmed in our belief when we saw the polling. Yes, that's about what I thought it would be.
Right, exactly.
And so, okay, so that's why I think, it was logically there on paper, and then the polling seemed to confirm what we thought we would see. Okay. But as I also, mentioned when we started this broadcast, I think there were things that we didn't quite fully appreciate. We knew they were there. We just didn't give them the kind of heft that perhaps the voters were giving. And that's really the drag, the headwind that Democrats faced in building enthusiasm because of the dysfunction in Washington, D.C. that has really been since August. And the headwind of just an electorate that is angrier, just not happy. And that's not a good place to be in charge when the electorate is not happy.
Well,
And finally, the thing that, why we missed it was that I think we didn't quite appreciate we overestimated how much credit people were going to give to Phil Murphy. They were going to give it on paper. They would give it when a pollster asked them about it in terms of how Murphy had handled the pandemic, but were they going to vote for him because of that? It doesn't appear that we understood that it wasn't going to be that kind of really motivating factor. On the other hand, for those, a minority of New Jerseyans, but nonetheless a sizable chunk, those who didn't like the way Phil Murphy has managed the pandemic, they were ready to vote, and they were ready to vote on that issue. We saw them, I don't think we gave them a full appreciation that perhaps now, having seen the results, we can look back and say, yeah, we underestimated how influential those factors were going to be.
Got it. Well, Ben, thank you so much for joining us today. I want you to know you have the distinction of being the first guest who has appeared on this podcast 3 times. I am
thrilled. Thank you. And something that a real who won in this election is really American democracy, New Jersey democracy. There are billions of people in the world who don't get to do what New Jerseyans got to do this week. And that is to go out and vote and not have to vote for the people who are there just because they're there. People voted the way they felt. We had a contentious, hard-fought election, and kudos to New Jersey and to democracy because we ran it well. This isn't about fraud. This isn't about those kinds of allegations flying back and forth. We had a race. It was a close race, and people got to do it. And I think even the winners are going to recognize, hey, there's a sizable part of New Jersey that is feeling something else, and we need to be sensitive to that. That's what elections are about. And I think we can be very proud of what happened here this week, because there are billions of people in the world who don't have this opportunity.
Well, Ben, once again, thank you so much for joining him. And please take a rest and, take care of your vocal cords there. I'm sure you've been on the phone and on the cameras for the last 48 hours straight, but we want you to feel better, and we definitely want you to join us again. So again, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all for listening and watching. Watch soon for the results of our member survey about what CPAs say the governor's top priorities should be, and some actionable ideas for addressing them. Those results will be published soon at njcpa.org/advocacy. And I encourage all NJCPA members to contribute to the NJCPA PAC. At an average of only $4 per member, New Jersey CPA's PAC support is far below that of other professions in the state. Please consider making a contribution today at njcpa.org/PAC.